Now, Anne, we're just going to get to know you. Why would you seek a leadership role within a publishing company among all other businesses?
Well, I've always had a fondness for books and what they represent. Growing up in a rather wealthy family, I've been given an impressive education, especially for a woman. I've also done some studying abroad in France while serving Queen Claude. In France, I was educated in all forms, not just mathematics or science, but also in religion, dance, music, art, etc., etc. Because of this education that I've received, I'm very well read, which is not exactly common for women where I come from. Because of the opportunities I've received, I made sure that at my previous place of employment, my staff was well read and had access to education, especially when it came to Gospels and Scripture. Due to my previous elevated position, I've also been given the opportunity to meet and converse with some of the greatest intellectuals and reformers in the world. To paraphrase, books represent not only education to me, but power, and those are some of the most essential factors of life in my book. Get it?
You mentioned your previous place of employment. Have you had any previous experience in leading a company? How did your employment come to an end?
I've not actually led a business before, but I do have some pretty substantial leadership experience. I was actually the Queen of England for 3 years, though most of the power that I wielded in the country actually happened leading up to my hiring. See, in order to become the Queen, I had to have King Henry VIII pull a few strings on my behalf. These strings actually played a pretty big role in England. I was behind some of the greatest changes in the history of the country, and I have to say that I did a pretty good job of doing it. To be completely honest, though, my termination was not on good terms. After a rather unfortunate concussion, my husband grew tyrannical. His management of the country became ineffective, and I did not hesitate in letting him know what I thought. To add on to the predicament, I happened to give birth to a girl rather than a boy who would one day replace his position. Henry's resentment grew, and when the time came to lay some people off, my head was on the chopping block. Literally.
If hired, would you implement any changes in our company? If so, what changes?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, for one thing, I've always been a huge fan of reform. I'm a big believer in doing away with traditional, old-fashioned ideals and embracing modern thinking and enlightened ideas. At my previous place of employment, when my husband and I were still on good terms, I was able to instigate a number of improvements after becoming queen. For example, the Protestant Reformation likely would not have been nearly as successful as it was without my input. I guess you could say that, behind the scenes, I hope to modernize and change the country forever, and I want to bring that same level of influence to all my places of employment. Therefore, I would like to bring Great Britain publishing into the modern era as well. Ebooks, for one thing, are growing increasingly popular right now. I've learned and researched a lot about the inner workings and necessity of ebooks for college students, ever since I learned that modern technology was not, in fact, witchcraft. Therefore, it's only rational that we step into the 21st century and promote publishing our books online as well as in print.
What qualities do you possess that make you a strong leader?
Well, for one thing, I'm persuasive. I mean, I'm not one to brag, but it doesn't take just anyone off the street to convince the King of England to divorce his wife, separate with the Roman Catholic Church, and establish a church of his own. I'm also pretty persistent. I mean, Henry and I courted for over 7 years until he could legally marry me. Not once in those 7 years did my confidence waver, and not once in those 7 years did I let him lose interest in me. I'm also a modern thinker. I'm quite the reformer, so to speak, always open to new, fresh ideas. I'm willing to listen, and I'm not one to be bound by traditions and customs, even if it makes me unpopular in the end. I'm also pretty personable and outgoing. I've always been able to connect with people and make a lot of friends easily. It's a skill that can make me popular and well-liked in any setting, professional or personal. Another thing, I'm pretty cultured. Growing up in both the English and French courts, I was exposed to all different kinds of people and ideas. My upbringing has made me into the knowledgeable and well-rounded person that I am today.
What are your biggest weaknesses?
Well, for one thing, I do tend to be a bit stubborn. You should know that when I set my mind to something, I intend to accomplish it. Consequences be damned. Like I said, when I sought to become the Queen of England, I wasn't going to let some silly, centuries-old religious institution stand in my way and tell me how to live my life. Looking back, I suppose stubbornness can be a positive or a negative, depending on how you look at it. I certainly look upon it with more favor than most people do, though. Another thing, I tend to be a little bit hot-headed. During stressful or frustrating times, I do tend to lose my head, so to speak. I've been told I'm a very passionate person, and I suppose that sometimes my mouth moves faster than my mind does. This may generally be considered a negative quality, especially for a woman of my time, but I view it as more of a strength, you know? I can plan ahead, but I also know how to live in the heat of the moment. My ex-husband, unfortunately, was one of those who viewed my hot-headedness unfavorably, and that did contribute to a pretty nasty separation. That is, my head from my body.
Finally, why are you interested in a CEO position?
Well, I got a taste of leadership and influence during my courtship with Henry. He was willing to do anything on my behalf. It was as if I were pulling the strings of Henry's reign for 7 years. However, once we actually got married, all the actual ruling power went to my husband. The most ruling power that I attained once I was queen was whether French hoods or English gables were in style that season. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate fashion just as much as any other English rose, but my thinking capacity can actually extend beyond headwear. Anyway, I settled into married life, and as I watched his reign, there were so many times when I thought, well, I would have done this instead, or I could have done that, and better. Over time, my frustration within my stifling little box of queenship grew. I knew that if I was in charge, I could be remembered as one of the greatest monarchs that England had ever known. Clearly, I'm a master of strategy, and getting ahead when the odds are stacked against me, which, in my opinion, are two of the most important qualities that a CEO can possess. If you ask me, I suppose I simply want to further and improve the interests of an organization larger than myself, especially for an organization I care so deeply for.